Hello, this is Mr. Fredericks, and I'm here to talk today about the Paris Peace Conference. Kind of ended World War I. So let's get to it. World War I occurred from 1914 to 1918. Now, this is a war that we are not exactly happy about. It's probably the most regretted war in the history of the world. Now, we're going to get into all the reasons why, but when it was finally over, the countries had to come together to put the world back together again. It was absolutely destroyed. So the leaders of the world got together after World War I and came to Paris, because why not? You got to go somewhere. Why not Paris? Well, they have a conference. Here you can see the conference going on. I'm not sure if this is opening or closing ceremonies, but this is the Paris Peace Conference. They're going to save the world. They're going to figure out how to make sure World War I never happens again, and how can we fix the world. So that's the Paris Peace Conference. Now, after 6 months of arguing, they come up with a treaty there, and that treaty is going to be called the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was produced by the Paris Peace Conference, and it was signed at the very beautiful Versailles Palace, which is located right outside of Paris, just a little bit, and that's why it's called the Treaty of Versailles. It was signed there. Now, either way, it's all began on January 18th, 1919. Lots of countries went to the Paris Peace Conference, but who was in charge? Very important to know. And the answer was the United States, but also the UK, France, and Italy. This group is going to be known as the Big Four. The Big Four was a nickname of the four leaders of those countries, but also people refer to the Big Four as the four countries themselves sometimes. Either way, the Big Four ran the conference. Now, why are they in charge? Why them? Why not me? But the answer was that they were the strongest countries. So they kind of got to say, because they had the biggest militaries, what was going to happen. But they also had lost the most troops in World War I, so they said that we lost the most, so we should have the most say in how to fix the world. They also said we had done the most. We're the ones that beat Germany and Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria and Ottoman Empire. So therefore, we're the ones who get to say what happens, because we're the victors. So now what? Well, at this point, the Big Four and all those other countries come to Paris Peace Conference to fix the world. So 1 year earlier, a guy by the name of Woodrow Wilson, president of the U.S., introduced a plan. He said even before the U.S. was part of the war, even before the war was over, Wilson presented a plan to the U.S., but to the world, about how to create peace so that World War I never happens again. This plan was called the 14 Points. Now, it does not take an advanced degree to figure out how many ideas the man had in this plan. 14. So the 14 points had 14 ideas that if we just followed the 14 points, then we would have peace forever. So basically, when Wilson shows up to the Paris Peace Conference, he brings the 14 points. The world knows he's bringing it. He's saying, why don't we just make the 14 points our Treaty of Versailles? But it's going to be 6 months of arguing over the 14 points, and Wilson's not going to get most of his 14 points to be counted. Let's look at it. So the first debate of the Paris Peace Conference is going to be focused on the first point that Woodrow Wilson had. He said no secret treaties. From now on, no countries can enter into secret agreements, because when Austria-Hungary at the beginning of World War I attacked Serbia, they had no idea that there was a secret alliance between Serbia and Russia. They never would have attacked Serbia if they knew that that meant war with Russia. And of course, Russia didn't know that Germany was going to hop into its war with Austria-Hungary. And of course, Germany wasn't totally aware that France was going to hop in to support Russia. But most importantly, when Germany attacked Belgium, they didn't know Great Britain was going to come into the war with their whole empire. So all these countries thought they were getting involved in small wars that turned out to be huge because of secret alliances. So they discussed this, and it became part of the Treaty of Versailles. Like many parts of the Treaty of Versailles, it turned out later that a lot of these provisions weren't enforceable, but they were pretty much conceptually in agreement. So debate number 2 at the Paris Peace Conference, freedom of the seas. Now, Wilson was saying, hey, when you don't have freedom of the seas, your ships get sunk, and then countries like the U.S. get yanked into wars, because that's what happened in World War I. So Wilson was saying, in times of peace and war, every country should be allowed to trade with everyone. If that happens, you're not going to pull in all these other countries. Bottom line is, conceptually, most countries were in agreement at the Paris Peace Conference about this. It just, once again, later just proved impossible to enforce. That was a good idea, but no formal agreement. Debate number 3. Wilson's like, I've got another idea. Number 5, self-determination. Now, this might be the most important, or at least top 2 of Wilson's ideas about how to create peace. Basically, what self-determination is, according to Wilson, is that all people in the world should get to choose who their government is, what nation they want to be a part of. So, for example, these 2 empires, Germany and Austria, no, you're not allowed to just conquer people and make them part of your empire. The only people that should be in Germany are Germans. So that is what self-determination is about. People should be free. For example, Austria in 1908 conquered Bosnia. No, that should not have happened. The Bosnian people, mostly Serbs, should be allowed to join Serbia if that's what they want. So if that had been true, we never would have had the Black Hand Forum to protest, or the Black Hand's killing of Franz Ferdinand, which led to the war. So self-determination was basically no imperialism, break up empires, let people be free, then we'll never have war. Wilson was all about this, but when he showed up at the Paris Peace Conference, he was ignored. Britain and France, 2 members of the Big Four, were like, absolutely not. We hate self-determination. Why? Because they wanted power. They just want a huge war, and to the victor goes the spoils. They wanted to take land away from Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, and Germany. They didn't just want to say, don't worry about it. We won, but we're not going to take anything. So they wanted to take the German colonies and increase their power, and they actually do. So self-determination is not going to happen. But second example, those countries also just hated the Central Powers, hated Germany. They wanted revenge for all that death that they experienced. And they wanted something in return for the misery that they went through to defeat Germany. So they wanted to take land away from Germany to punish them. And the land you see there highlighted in red was land that they eventually took. So Wilson didn't get this either. At the Treaty of Versailles took lots of land from Germany. And those people were Germans that now lived in other countries. So they're not going to get self-determination. The reason that's important is those Germans are going to think nothing except, how do I go to war to get back to my own country? And Germany is going to feel the same way. So number 3 on why self-determination didn't work out, fear of a future Germany. France had gone through 2 German invasions in just the last 50 years, creating millions of deaths. They wanted to punish and take as much land from Germany as possible to weaken them. So here's another example. This is Czechoslovakia. If you look down here, this is Germany, and then this is Czechoslovakia. It also includes this area right here. Basically, the United States and the Big Four were like, if we're going to contain Germany in the future, we need to surround them with big countries. So we don't want to just break up all the people. Then you'll have all these little countries that can be conquered. So instead, they combined the Czechs and the Slovaks into Czechoslovakia to make a big country. And that, of course, is going to anger Germany for a couple reasons. Reason number 1, they're also going to take the Germans that live here, about 3 million of them, and give them to Poland. Why did they do that? Because they wanted the Polish people to have access to the sea and trade so they'd be wealthy. But that still put 3 million Germans in Poland, which is going to anger Germany so much. So self-determination is not going to happen. Land is going to be taken from the losers of the war. That's Austria and Germany. And unfortunately, in the years to come, next 20 years, all they're going to think about is going to war again to get that land back. So here's another example of self-determination not working out. Basically, this country here is Yugoslavia. It first was created after World War I by the Paris Peace Conference. They wanted a big, huge country here to once again stand up to Germany. But they gave this land to their ally, Serbia. This was Serbia here, an ally, and they won the war because they were on the winning team, and they gave them this land. So unfortunately, at the Paris Peace Conference, when countries win wars, they want rewards, and they were given rewards, which is unfortunate because in Yugoslavia, there were all types of people, the Slovenians, the Croatians. There's so many different types of people, and Serbia now was in charge of all of them, and that's going to lead to decades of war after. So the Ottoman Empire, same thing. The Ottoman Empire is going to own all of this land, and they got defeated. So what Wilson said was, let all these people go free. But instead, the Ottomans' lands were given to Britain and France, turned into mandates. So the British got this chunk that would later become Iraq and Jordan, and the French got what would become Syria and Lebanon, and basically those people were not let free, and Britain and France wanted to increase their power. Wilson's like, well, you outnumber me. I guess I'm going to have to let you do this. So self-determination failed completely, and that's going to directly lead to World War II. So Wilson didn't get what he wanted. Debate number 4 at the Paris Peace Conference, disarmament. Now, Wilson blamed World War I on all these countries of Europe being absolutely militarized. So militarized, and that was a problem. Europe was armed to the teeth with all of their arms races. So Wilson had a plan. Part of his 14 points at the Paris Peace Conference is like, how about we make all of Europe demilitarized? Get rid of their weapons. That will lead to peace. Countries that don't have weapons are not going to be anxious to fight. They're not going to be committed to fight. They're not going to love war because they can't make war. So what ended up happening at the Paris Peace Conference was the Allies all agreed to basically demilitarize Germany and nobody else. And that was a problem because Germany saw this as hypocritical. Why are they the only ones being punished? They had to get rid of their navy, most of their army, all their weapons. So basically Germany was punished and lost all of their military might. And that's going to create anger because they thought it was hypocritical because the war wasn't just their fault. But to an extent, even though it wasn't forced upon them, the countries of Europe did buy into the conceptual idea that weapons lead to war, and they demilitarized too. Not as much as Germany was forced to. But the problem was, this is going to backfire because once Germany started secretly remilitarizing in the 30s, the other allies were left with almost no militaries. And Hitler's just going to pick them off one by one. So you could argue that weapons cause war, but also the lack of weapons can cause war as well. So that didn't totally work out, so we can kind of blame Wilson for that. Debate number 5, the trade-off. Basically, Wilson did not get everything that he wanted in what we just talked about. All those great ideas like self-determination, demilitarizing, things like that. But the reason he was willing to compromise and give those up was he went after the most important 14 point, was the 14th, the creation of the League of Nations. This was what Wilson really thought was the key to future peace. Now, before 1914, Europe had a problem. In the past, a strong country would emerge, whether Germany, France, or somebody else, and then another country would get fearful. So they would get a bunch of allies to team up to balance against that strong country. But then that strong country would get 2 countries that are friends, and now you had these 2 huge groups ready to battle, armed to the teeth. Now this system, this dynamic of Europe was called the balance of power. Pretty much anybody who became more powerful was met with other countries forming alliances to equal that power, and this led to huge wars. You no longer just had one-on-one wars, you had huge alliances. So the balance of power system led to massive death. Before World War I, these were your 2 major alliances, England, France, Russia, and then Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, known as the Triple Alliance, and before that, the Triple Entente. So in 1919, Wilson's like, we have to be able to do this better. So he comes up with a plan for peace, the League of Nations, his 14th point, and it's based on this principle called collective security, which he wants to replace balance of power. So here's how collective security works. When one country is the aggressor and attacks another, instead of 2 teams forming, everybody is on the same team. The team would be called the League of Nations, and they would be required to all attack the aggressor. So it would be like 50 versus 1, 100 versus 1 to save that other country. Now, Wilson believed that this would lead to no more war ever, because what country would be stupid enough to attack another if it knew that 50 countries were then going to attack it? We would never have war again. Wilson's a genius, the League of Nations and collective security, so awesome, except it failed. The League was formed by the Treaty of Versailles, but it wasn't a success, in part because the US and Russia, the 2 biggest, most powerful countries, did not join it, and we'll talk about why later. You can't really be a successful bodyguard, a successful military organization with your 2 strongest countries not in it. Now, collective security is also going to fail because when one country attacked another, everyone was supposed to attack it. But that just didn't turn out. Turns out our countries were more selfish and into self-interest. When one country attacked another, what ended up happening was countries were like, oh, I hated World War I. I hate war. I'm not going to get another one. I'm not going to fight a huge war and send troops for some country I've never heard of. I'm not going to do that. And the result of it was, even though everybody collectively was supposed to secure other countries, nobody cared enough to do so. So the League of Nations is going to fail. Germany, Italy, and Japan are going to start conquering everything, and nobody is going to do anything about it, particularly the League of Nations countries and so on. So it proves as a failure, and we get rid of it after World War II. We replace it with the United Nations, which we still have today. Debate number 5, paying for the war. Well, Britain and France had a clear idea. Their problem about paying for the war was that they had so many people that had died in this war, and they had spent so much money that they were broke, and their countries were destroyed, particularly France, that they needed somebody to pay for it. And they're like, well, should we pay for it? And they're like, no, Germany started the war. They invaded Belgium, attacking France. Germany is to blame. Now, this was called in the Treaty of Versailles the War Guilt Clause. The treaty basically opens by saying Germany is to blame for it and Germany should pay for it. Why should anybody else? Now, Wilson's like, don't do it. This is wrong. Don't blame Germany. We should have a war without victors and without losers. Don't charge them money. But Wilson is going to lose out. Britain and France and Italy just didn't care. Now, Wilson's argument was if we hurt Germany, they're going to get angry and they're just going to desire a future war. But he was ignored. They're like, no. We need to punish them so they never do it again. Wilson's like, that's not going to work. Either way, Britain and France agree that Germany has to pay $55 billion, which back during World War I was a massive amount of money. Today, not so much, maybe. So the results was exactly what Wilson thought. Germany over the next 20 years is going to be angry. Why are they? And that anger is going to lead to an angry leader. If your people are happy, you elect happy politicians. If you're angry, you're going to elect somebody who's angry, demanding for revenge. And that's why Hitler was elected, because he promised to undo the Treaty of Versailles and undo these reparations. So in a way, you could say that the growth of Hitler was because of Britain and France and the Paris Peace Conference mistakes. So debate number 6. Should Germany be crushed? You know what? We just talked about they should pay for the war, but should they be crushed beyond that? And that was the debate. Now, of course, Wilson was like, no, don't crush them. They'll want revenge. However, who said this? 1/4 of the men between the ages of 18 and 30 are dead. In what country? The trenches destroyed 1/5 of this country's land. Germany destroyed their factories. They want revenge. Who am I talking about? And the answer is France. France is angry at the Paris Peace Conference. Now, what country said the following? We must destroy Germany with this treaty so they can never come back and attack us again. So not only, and that would be France again. So France is thinking 2 ways. 1, they want revenge, but 2, they want to destroy Germany so it can't happen again, which is a very practical thing. So France is paranoid. Now, why are they justifiably paranoid? Because they lost a friend during this war. They lost Russia. Russia was taken over by Vladimir Lenin in the Russian Revolution of 1917. That's when Russia dropped out of World War I. Now, the only thing that saved France in World War I against a massive Germany was the fact that a 2-front war was created between France and Russia, so that Germany had to split their troops in half and be half as strong. Now they don't have that. Russia has dropped out. They become the communist Soviet Union under Lenin, and now France is by itself. So the reason why France is by itself is it absolutely despises communism. It despises Russia for dropping out of the war early, leaving them to fight Germany alone. So they're no longer allies, and Russia can't be counted on. So France gets an idea, and France says Germany should be cut into 10 pieces. If the Treaty of Versailles cuts Germany into 10 pieces, they'll be so unbelievably weak, we don't have to fear them anymore. Britain, though, stepped in and said, France, we're friends on most things, but not this. We need to keep a strong Germany. Why? Because you, France, this is Britain saying this, you think that the enemy and monster of Europe is still Germany. No, they've been defeated in World War I. There's a bigger monster out there, and that is now Russia, communist Soviet Union. They're the enemy. They're the biggest. If you study communism, it's the theory that poor people around the world, it doesn't say Russia, it says around the world, will unite, realize that they outnumber rich people, will rise up in violent revolution, kill them or lock away all the capitalists, and take all of their stuff and make everybody equal. And that pretty much means all the governments of the capitalist world will be gone, and the rich will be gone. So Britain's like, that's what we want to avoid. We can't let communism take over or we'll all be dead. So Germany needs to be kept at least a little strong so they can hold up Russia, because traditionally Russia has always been held back by Germany when it comes to Europe. So Russia is now the big enemy, not Germany anymore. And that's why Germany was not cut up into 10 countries after World War I. I think people are going to regret this after World War II, but that was the decision that was made. Debate number 7. If we can't cut up Germany, how can we at least weaken it? Well, here's what happened at the Paris Peace Conference. They said, well, let's weaken it this way. Now, let's see Germany's colonial empire, and we're going to take all those away from it. So now it doesn't have those natural resources and raw materials and so on. They will be weaker. So Germany was angry about that because they just lost their empire, which they had a lot of pride in. But you know what? Britain and France said, well, Germany's down now. It's our time to impose our will on them, so let's just keep kicking them. Second thing they did was the reparations, $55 billion. I think it was billion. And that went to Britain because Britain wanted an exact amount to go to all the women and children that lost their fathers, their husbands. So all of them, you remember this is World War I, women didn't work, so women were somewhat helpless at this point, families were somewhat helpless, and Britain wanted money to take care of their families for the rest of their life. That was what the reparations were for. France wanted $55 billion to rebuild their country. Their country was absolutely crushed and destroyed. That's where the war was. Now, the unintended consequence of these reparations was in the 1920s, Germany was paying all of their money to the Allies in the form of reparations. Not the U.S., because the U.S. wouldn't take any reparations, because Wilson's 14 points were like, we shouldn't punish anybody, they'll just want revenge. But anyway, Britain and France didn't believe that, so they took all that money. Germany ran out of money in the 1920s, and their response was, well, we still have to pay reparations, let's just print more money. So they printed billions of marks, and those marks became worthless, the German currency. Basically, here you see children taking millions of their dollars, their marks, and stacking them because they're not worth anything. People had to take wheelbarrows to the grocery store just to buy things. So ultimately, your money became worthless in Germany. And if you don't have any money, then you can't get food. So people rioted. They took everything from the stores. Food riots were awful, and Germany became miserable in the 20s. So the reparations and that misery led to Hitler. Hitler was so angry about this, what came about to his country, and all that misery, that he said, I'll undo this, I'll fix this, I'll get revenge. And the Germans were like, yes, absolutely, I want to elect you. So once again, Britain and France weren't done. They're like, you know what, we got to weaken Germany some more. So they kept kicking them. So another example is they actually took land away from Germany, not just their colonies, but the actual land that had millions of Germans in it. All of this land that you see in red was taken from Germany. Now, what hurt them most was this place called Alsace-Lorraine right here. Germany always felt that this land belonged to them. France thought it belonged to them. Germany took it from France in 1871. France is now taking it back. And Germans are going to be angry about it, and they're going to vow revenge, and someday they'll get it back. So again, Germany's angry, but Britain and France not done. Fifth reason, France still a little paranoid about a future Germany coming back to hurt them. And they should be paranoid because Germany is right up on their border. They share a border. It's one thing for Woodrow Wilson in the United States to say, no, be nice to Germany, don't hurt them. But U.S. is like thousands of miles away. France is right next door to this Germany. And Germany has 4 times the population of France. So France is like, no, we need to weaken them. So we need a buffer zone. We were right next to them. So a buffer zone is kind of an area between a group to allow them not to be right next to each other, because that will cause them to get into a fight. And the Rhineland, the land off of the Rhine River, the Western Germany is going to be that Rhineland. So France at the Paris Peace Conference says that the Treaty of Versailles has to require Germany to leave the Rhineland. Their people can still live there, but this cannot be militarized. You cannot have any military there. Germany cannot do what it wants with this land. So demilitarize the Rhineland. Now, this is for 2 reasons. 1, because now the military isn't right up on France, so they're not less nervous. And 2, if Germany at any point sends the military in to attack France, France at least now will see it coming. But this is going to be a backfire because Germany is going to see this as a slap in the face. It's one thing for you to take our colonies away from us, but now you're telling us what to do with our own land and our own people? No. And this is going to be one of the major reasons why Hitler gets elected, because he says, I'm going to undo this. This is not fair. So, but still, Britain and France still not done picking on Germany in the Treaty of Versailles. And this is going to transition to the debate at the Paris Peace Conference about Czechoslovakia. So Czechoslovakia is going to be located right here. This is the Czechs and this is the Slovaks. And the whole idea was before World War I, there was Austria-Hungary. And here's Austria. But no more empires, right? Remember self-determination? So we're going to take Austria, and this is the land they're going to be able to keep. And then we're going to take all this and let them go free. So the Czechs are going to be right here, and the Slovaks are right here. And the discussion at the Paris Peace Conference is, let's give the Slovaks to the Czechs and kind of have them in a partnership. And then they will be a big enough country to withstand Germany. The idea was having 4 big countries surrounding Germany: Great Britain, France, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. And that was the idea. But there's a problem here. The problem is this part of Czech, this land right here is called the Sudetenland. And it has a lot of Czechs in it, but it also has 3 million Germans. And you can make a case that this should belong to Germany. However, we didn't want to add land to Germany after they lost the war. We wanted to take it away. So the Paris Peace Conference, the Big Four, said, let's give the Sudetenland to Czechoslovakia. It'll make them bigger, it'll make Germany weaker not having it. And that land will then the Sudetenland is a perfect defensive area. It's mountainous. So if Germany ever wants to attack Czechoslovakia, they can't send their troops through those mountains. So it's like a defensive barrier for them. Also, mountains have an endless amount of resources. So, they have an endless amount of resources. So all those raw materials will make Czechoslovakia strong. So that's the idea. At the Paris Peace Conference, they decided to give the Sudetenland to Czechoslovakia rather than Germany. Now, this is a problem because those 3 million Germans now live in Czechoslovakia. They're now part of that country. Now, this land was supposed to protect Czechoslovakia by making it strong. It's going to end up making it a target. Before World War II, Hitler's like, I'm going to invade Czechoslovakia. I want my people back. They own 3 million of my people. That's not fair. And that's exactly what happens in 1938. Hitler invades Czechoslovakia and crushes that country to get his people back. So that is going to be a failure at the Paris Peace Conference, taking land and people away from Hitler, or should I say Germany, and they're just going to desire to take the land back. Debate number 9 at the Paris Peace Conference, a place called Teschen. Teschen was another great or horrible idea of the Paris Peace Conference of the Big Four. Basically, the idea was that Poland and Czechoslovakia, here's Czechoslovakia, here's Poland, were supposed to be the best of friends, huge and powerful, so they could contain a future Germany. But the problem was that there was this piece of, 2-on-1, so again, if a future Germany ever went east to attack, they would team up against Germany 2 against 1. But the problem with this alliance is this place called Teschen that has both Polish people living there and Czechs living there, and both of them have owned that area at some point. So both think they're the rightful owners of Teschen. So what at the Paris Peace Conference, what do? They give the land not as a shared area or a neutral zone, they give it to Czechoslovakia. And this angers Poland so much that they lost their land, their people, that Poland hates Czechoslovakia. They're like, they took our land. This isn't okay. So during World War II, as the buildup happens, Germany is going to attack Czechoslovakia. The whole point was Poland was supposed to team up and they were supposed to take Germany out. But Poland let it happen because they didn't like Czechoslovakia. And what happened when Germany invaded Czechoslovakia? Poland took this area and seized it. And now, a couple months later, Germany attacks Poland. Does Czechoslovakia at that point help Poland? No, because they don't exist. So the whole plan fell apart because of the anger about Teschen between Poland and Czechoslovakia. Just a terrible decision. Debate number 10, what should happen with Russia? Well, wasn't Russia a partner with the Allies? Weren't they on the good guys team? And they were part of the Allies. But in 1917, 1 year before the war went away, Vladimir Lenin took over Russia. They had the Russian Revolution, and the Allies hated communism. They figured communism was just a huge movement for the poor to rise up in violent revolution to kill all the rich and take everything they had. So, problem is, Russia lost more lives than anybody in World War I. So when Germany lost the war, Russia's like, I should be rewarded. Now, but the problem was, the Big Four, the Paris Peace Conference leaders hated Russia. So they weren't going to give Russia anything. The Treaty of Versailles actually took millions of miles away from Russia. Now let's talk about why. During the war, when Russia was still in the war, before the Russian Revolution, Germany was in a two-front war, but Germany was crushing Russia. They had, once again, here are the borders of Germany, but Germany had conquered all this land from Russia, and Russia was losing the war. So basically, Russia was going to give up. When Lenin took over, he says, I'll tell you what, Germany, if you stop fighting us, I will give you all this land. And that was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Basically, Russia and Lenin said, hey, take all of this land you conquered, just leave the rest of us alone. So Germany turned out to be a huge winner in 1917. They end up winning all this land from Russia. So at that point, though, a year goes by, and Germany ends up losing the war itself when the U.S. joins. Now, when the U.S. invades and beats Germany, now what do we do with this land? Basically, Germany lost the war, so they should lose the land that they conquered, but the Allies hated Russia, and they didn't want to give the land back to Russia. They dropped out of the war and were now communists. So what do you do with this land? Now, this land had always been conquered by either the Germans or the Russians, but now both were losers. The first time in history where both were weak. So at this point, the Allies, the Big Four, agreed, why don't we give it their freedom, self-determination. We'll give the Poles their freedom for the first time in hundreds of years. The Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Estonians, they can all have their own countries, Finland. So that's exactly what the Allies do. The Treaty of Versailles gives them their freedom. We have a bunch of new countries there. Now, who do you think was angered by this? Russia, because they lost all their land, and Germany, because they lost all their land. And in 1939, 20 years later, World War II under Hitler starts when Germany invades Poland from the west, and the Soviet Union, Russia, invades Poland from the east. Soviet Union is going to go and conquer eastern Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland to take back what was theirs. So the Treaty of Versailles caused World War II by taking this land away. Now, to add to that, the debate at the Paris Peace Conference was what should happen with the Polish people. Wilson's 14 points, number 13, was give the Polish people their freedom. There's Poland, and it is completely landlocked, has no access to water, the Polish people, so they can't trade. That costs them billions of dollars, billions. And if you're a poor country, you can't have a strong military, and a future Germany or Russia is just going to conquer them, and that's bad. So the Big Four wanted to make Poland stronger economically so that they could be protected. And the idea was this: let's give Poland a little corridor to the sea so they can trade. So this is where the Polish people live, but let's cut out a piece of Germany right here where Germans live, 3 million of them, and we'll call it the Polish corridor. It now belongs to Poland, so Poland can get to the sea. Now the problem is, this is Germany. Look, they owned all this. So to give Poland this land, you're taking their land away. 3 million Germans will now live in Poland. So once again, the Polish corridor cut right through all of this was Germany. And you never take land from a vanquished enemy. They just want revenge and leads to future wars. And that's what's going to happen with Germany and the Soviet Union, that anger. So debate number 12, what do we do with the Ottoman Empire? So this is what remained of the Ottoman Empire. It was once much larger. But at the beginning of World War I, this was it. The Ottoman Turks owned all this. The Ottoman Empire is going to be allied with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria. They're part of the Central Powers. And they lost the war. So what happens with all the land they own, all this land? Well, that's complicated. Wilson said, let it go free. Let people be free, self-determination. But Britain and France were like, no, we want the land. So they created mandates. Mandates basically said, well, these people aren't civilized enough to run themselves. They're unfit for self-rule. So we're going to take them over until they're ready to rule. The British took Iraq. They took Transjordan, that would later become Jordan, and they took what later would be called Palestine and Israel. And the French took Lebanon and Syria, essentially colonies, but they didn't call them colonies because that sounds like imperialism, and that's wrong. They called them mandates. We're just going to own them and exploit them until they're ready to rule themselves, which has turned out to be about 30 years later. So Wilson was ignored. Now, debate number 13 at the Paris Peace Conference, Austria-Hungary. What to do with them? So Wilson said, break up that empire and let all the people have their own countries. However, this is a huge empire. It was actually bigger than Germany's. And after World War I at the Paris Peace Conference, they're going to give their freedom to all these groups. Austria is left with just this. The Czechs, the Slovaks were combined to be a big country next to Germany. Hungary was given its freedom. A big chunk of Hungary and this land over here was given to Romania because they were on the winning side. Bulgaria lost some land to Romania. And then here's Yugoslavia. Now, that was a new country created and controlled by Serbia. So that's what happened. Now, Italy was angry because Italy went to war with Austria-Hungary when they were promised to be given land right here in Austria-Hungary. But after the war, the Allies didn't give them any land, instead made all these new countries, including Yugoslavia, because Serbia, the Big Four at the Paris Peace Conference chose to reward Serbia, who was an ally, by giving them all this land instead of giving it to Italy. Now, why do they do that? A couple reasons. Now, let's talk about Italy. Italy originally wasn't in World War I. They actually were on they were on Germany's side, but we got them to switch teams. At the Treaty of London, Britain convinced Italy to switch teams by saying, hey, if you go to war against Austria-Hungary, we in return will give you this land in Austria-Hungary. And that's what Italy wanted. So Italy switched sides and joined the Allies in 1915 and so on. Now, the hope was that Italy would battle Austria-Hungary in the Ottoman Empire. But 4 years later at the Paris Peace Conference, the Big Four were like, no, Italy, you're not going to get what you want because we want self-determination. These people should go free. We want the Serbs to control this area. So self-determination was why Yugoslavia got created. Now, we didn't want to just give Italy a bunch of land over here. That would just be a new empire that would lead to new assassinations. But why did the Allies break their promise besides that? Well, in 1914, 1918, Italy was weak. They were absolutely not a powerhouse. But they had joined the Allies to basically crush the Ottoman Empire and try to control the Mediterranean Sea for the Allies. But they failed. Every time they fought the Ottoman Empire, they pretty much lost. Italy also was supposed to battle Austria-Hungary, but they lost pretty much all those battles too. So the Allies were like, you really didn't do much, Italy. Sorry, we're going to side with self-determination and create Yugoslavia. You're not going to get anything. Italy is going to feel betrayed, and they're going to join Hitler in World War II to try to get the land they think they deserved. Debate number 15, and this wouldn't even be at the Paris Peace Conference. So the Paris Peace Conference ends, 6 months of them debating what we just talked about, and they created this Treaty of Versailles, a book of agreements. And Wilson loved it. He's like, I created this. But in the U.S., when you make a treaty, you actually have to have the U.S. Senate ratify it. And they have to vote. And you need 2/3 of the Senate to ratify a treaty. That's 96 members back then. 64 votes Wilson needed to get this treaty to count. Now, the U.S. Senate was kind of divided into 3 groups of people. And they all needed to vote, and Wilson needed to get their support. And one of the groups voted yes. Those were the and one of the groups voted no. They were called the Irreconcilable. That's just a nickname. Irreconcilable is a fancy word that means I will never like you or whatever you have. So the Irreconcilables were senators that hated the treaty and no matter what would never agree with it. Now, there was a group called the Reservationists that didn't like the treaty. They had some reservations, but if they could change it just a little bit, they would support it. And finally, that third group was the Democrats that supported Wilson that were going to vote for the treaty. So can we get 66 votes out of that or 64? And the answer is going to be no. The Irreconcilables are like, I'm not voting for it. And now here's their reasons why the Treaty of Versailles they did not like. Reason number 1, Wilson, when he went to France to make the treaty, brought so many people with him, but not a single Republican. And the Republicans were the head of the Senate. So the Republicans were like, this isn't my treaty. You didn't invite me. You snubbed me. No, I'm not going to vote for your stupid treaty. Reason number 2, we had just finished World War I. Enough is enough. The U.S. wanted to go back into isolationism, didn't want anything to do with the rest of the world, certainly didn't want to join a Treaty of Versailles or League of Nations so that we were constantly interacting and getting pulled into wars. So no, we wanted to mind our own business. That's why the Irreconcilables were against this treaty. Reason 3, now remember that whole plan about if one country attacks another, everybody in the league has to go to war to save that country? The U.S. didn't want to do that. The U.S. Senate or the U.S. Congress is the one that gets to decide whether to go to war or not even the president. But if we join this treaty, we're going to be required to go to war to save all countries in the world. Congress was like, no, we're not going to war because other countries want us to. We get to decide. Reason 4 why the Irreconcilables hated this treaty, we had previously given a speech called the Monroe Doctrine that basically said the Western Hemisphere was our backyard. We got to decide what to do. And we had since invaded those countries like 20 times to make sure they behaved the way that we wanted them to. We also invaded to protect those countries. And basically, if we join the League of Nations, in theory, we might be seen as the aggressor. The world might have to attack us. So no, we didn't want to follow that rule. Reason number 5, Some people made the case that the League supported imperialism, all those mandates in the Middle East that were taken over by Britain and France. But also, for example, Great Britain at this time owned Ireland, and Ireland wanted to be free. They weren't yet free. So if Ireland had a rebellion and got a bunch of guns, in theory, Great Britain could say that Ireland's attacking them, and all the League of Nations has to come in to help them put down the rebellion and basically subjugate the people of Ireland. So the interpretation of the irreconcilables was, if we join the League of Nations, we'll be called in to help countries keep control of their colonies as the colonies rebel. Reason number 6, while the irreconcilables were against the Treaty of Versailles, the 14 points was deemed the greatest plan ever to create peace, and it completely failed. Self-determination failed, all the ideas failed, all except like the 14th point, the League of Nations. So no, this is a terrible treaty. You did a horrible job, Wilson. We're not supporting it. So reparations, basically Germany had to pay a massive amount of reparations. They lost their colonies. They got land taken. The Treaty of Versailles is a recipe that's going to lead to another war. So the irreconcilables were like, no, we're not going to sign this or vote for it. So war seems inevitable. Reason 7 why the irreconcilables hated the treaty, because it was a democratic treaty. And if it got passed, it's a huge victory for Wilson. And the Democrats are just going to keep on getting elected. And they didn't want to give a win to Wilson or the Democrats. So now, that was the irreconcilables. The reservationists said, you know what, I kind of agree. But really, the biggest thing that I agree with, because the reservationists were like, well, if you just change the treaty a little bit, I'll vote for it. But their largest concern was what the irreconcilables had said about war. The reservationists wanted to keep the power to go to war in U.S. hands, did not want the U.S. being mandated to go to war to protect any country that got invaded. No. So they wanted that to be changed. Just change that part about the League of Nations, and then they would be fine. Now, that's what the reservationists said, but Wilson was like, no. Now, Wilson absolutely needs the reservationists in order to pass this treaty to get his 2/3 of vote. But he's not willing to change the Treaty of Versailles. He spent 6 months on it. If he changes it, he's going to have to call all the countries of the world back together to make those changes. And no. So what Wilson does instead is he says, no, I'm not changing it. And he goes on a tour across all of America. Now, the guy was just away for 6 months in Europe, and now he's traveling around the U.S., and he's already sick. In 23 days, he gives 36 speeches, and he ends up, that pressure causes him to have a stroke. And when he has a stroke, he basically gets confined to bed, is paralyzed through half of his body, and basically he was the top person that was leading the debate for the U.S. to join the League of Nations, to sign the Treaty of Versailles, to accept it, and now he can't even talk. He's bedridden. And the Congress goes forth and votes down the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles, says, I won't accept it. And then they vote a second time, they still reject it. And the United States never joins the League of Nations, never signs the Treaty of Versailles, signs a much smaller treaty of peace with Germany later on. But the U.S., no, stays out of it. In the 1920s and 30s, the U.S. goes back to isolationism, is not part of the League of Nations, doesn't help anybody with their problems, and bam, the world slowly goes towards hell, a literal hell almost, with the rise of the Axis powers in World War II. So kind of the lesson number 1 of the Paris Peace Accords is Wilson went into that trying to create this with this idealism about making the world perfect. And many people criticize him, saying his expectations and goals were not realistic. They did not take into account what other countries wanted, and therefore his plans all failed. And he just went for things that were unrealistic. He should have been more realistic and come up with better compromises. Number 2, Wilson wasn't willing to compromise on anything. He saw what he was doing as the work of God. It was completely right, and everybody else was wrong, and therefore he's not going to change anything. And what happened? The U.S. never joined the treaty. The Treaty of Versailles, all that work never happened for us, and the world is going to suffer for it. So the idea is, even though you might be idealistic and think you're right, you have to be willing to compromise in order to get something. Otherwise, you might get nothing, which is what Wilson got. Another lesson is harsh discipline. It doesn't matter. Whenever somebody does something wrong, you cannot treat them harsh. If you harshly punish them, they will just be resentful, desire revenge, and that will lead to more problems in the future. And that is the number 1 legacy of the Treaty of Versailles, Paris Peace Conference in World War I. So the objective of this presentation is for you to have a better understanding of maybe what not to do when creating a peace treaty, and certainly to understand the major concepts that were discussed there. Look for your assignment in Google Classroom. Thank you.